How much would you say are the specific and existential problems within housing contributing to the wider crises within our country?
Oh, it's huge. And it's one of the drivers, let's say, of many other social issues that ordinary individuals experience. I mean, housing often isn't seen on the list of things to tackle as a priority, and certainly not in the right areas. When you really think about it and think about an ordinary person, education, for example, if you're a child growing up and you're homeless, or you're living in temporary accommodation, or you're moved from different parts of the country simply for a place to call home, that affects your education. And often these young people are from disadvantaged backgrounds as it is. So we're not setting them up to prosper if we're allowing this issue to fester. And we know there's 145,000 homeless kids in England alone. But also earlier on, the NHS bosses came out and said you can't fix the NHS. You cannot claim to have fixed the NHS if you first and foremost haven't fixed housing. We know that the NHS, I believe it was last year, spent £1.4 billion looking after people living in poor conditions, 38 million spent on looking after those who had reached out to the NHS suffering with issues as a result of living in homes filled with damp and mould. We talk about crime, we talk about poverty and all of these other separate issues. But when you really think about it and link them back together, there's one common denominator. And that issue is often housing and people's housing situations. I've been into prisons and I've spoken to offenders. I've spoken to care leavers that have ended up in prison. And they all link it back to their housing situations growing up. And that is why housing needs to be taken seriously, because it is in an absolute state, the biggest crisis it has faced since the Second World War.
And this current status quo, as you mentioned, leads a lot of people and families to deal with homelessness. And you're 25 now, but you reveal in your book that you were twice made homeless when you were a child. And I think the first time you were 12 years old, and you sort of described having to sleep in a big yellow storage unit with your family. I mean, that's a really traumatic thing to deal with at such a young age. How did those experiences shape you?
Yeah, well, I mean, that specific experience I hadn't shared up until I'd written it in my book. And it was absolutely horrific, especially at the time. No child, no family should have had to, well, after school in our situation, had to sneak into a big yellow storage unit to sleep there overnight and hope you didn't get caught, because you weren't allowed to sleep on top of your furniture that was in there because the local authority wouldn't help you. It was absolutely dehumanizing, not just for me, but watching the interaction between my dad and the local authority too, the way he was spoken to, the disrespect that he was treated with. It showed me then that things were wrong. And at the age of 12, we really had to grow up. And there was a fear of telling our teachers. We wouldn't go into school the next day and think about even telling our teachers, because the first thing that would happen is social services would be on the phone and it's your parents that would be blamed. And that's a fear a lot of parents have even now when I speak to them about issues of homelessness or living in poor conditions. And it's completely wrong, because it's not their fault. And I've learned that now. But with that being said, I mean, that was about 14 years ago. Things have got far worse than what it was for me and my family back then. And it was absolutely horrific back then. So I have no doubt that there are other young people, there are other kids, there are other adults who are having to go through similar simply to survive, because they don't have a safe, affordable and decent place to call home. And it's a necessity for every single one of us as human beings in this country. We should all have access to it. But it has become, instead of a necessity, a luxury. And it's turned into the Hunger Games, trying to get decent and safe and affordable housing, especially those that are worst off within our society, working class individuals, those looking to get into social housing. 1.3 million people waiting for a social housing property. We've got kids that are 12 who have lived their entire lives as homeless, without a place to call home, without a place to call home after they finish school every day.
And of course, this is an intrinsically personal thing for you. You grew up in social housing and you lived in really tough conditions. Could you just sort of provide a bit of background as to the circumstances in which you grew up and what ultimately led you to first interacting and taking on your social housing provider, Clarion?
Yeah, so for the majority of my life, I've lived in social housing. And I mean, the second time we was homeless, we was eventually moved into temporary accommodation, which happened to be a converted car garage. Had damp and mould and all other issues within it. But that's before we got our permanent social home. And then we did, and obviously we was grateful because it was a place to call home, and we weren't told we had to move to Luton anymore for our home. But it was falling to bits. I mean, we had cockroaches, mice, damp, mould, kitchen that was nearly 100 years old, a bathroom which was falling to bits, lights filled with water, wood lice, you name it, poor security to the house. And we had been complaining about that. But then my dad became ill. He was diagnosed with esophageal cancer, a tumour in his throat. And he deteriorated really quickly within those conditions, and went from walking around and eating independently to having to be fed through his stomach and bedbound amongst those conditions, which no one should have been in. And then unfortunately passed away in January 2020, but things got far worse. On the day of his funeral, the ceiling collapsed directly above where his hospital bed was. And that was February 2020. No one came out until October of that year to look at it, amongst all of the sort of other issues. And I was becoming increasingly sick and tired of my housing provider that happened to be, at the time, the biggest in Europe, social housing provider, or housing association rather. And it got to a point where they promised they would come out. They were really disrespectful on the phone, hung up when they weren't coming out, said they were really busy. And I decided to take pictures, videos, upload it to social media. It went viral. National news picked it up, disgraced them into spending millions, not just on my estate, but estates in my local borough, because they managed the stock there. And I had been highlighting those estates too, where people were living in equally as bad conditions. And then people from around the country started reaching out, asking for help, asking if I could do the same. And I decided to travel around the country and go into people's homes and do just that. And it seemed to have worked. That shame element seemed to have got the housing providers to do, and local authorities do what they were supposed to for a very long time.
Yeah, it's a very modern form of activism, right? So like for our listeners who might not be aware, day to day, you're going across the country, viewing people's living situations and raising awareness and challenging a particular council or housing association by informing people who follow you on social media about the conditions that people are living in.
No, exactly. And things have sort of changed. I still do that. But on top of that, obviously constantly talking about the state of social housing publicly and on the news, for example, and going into housing providers, basically lecturing them on why they need to change things. And showing them the state of how people are having to live under their sort of leadership and as their landlord. So it's a sort of mix of all of that. I mean, it hasn't ever been given a specific job title. It's just a mishmash of me going out there campaigning, being a bit of a thorn in the side and pain in the backside, and trying to get the results that people who are often not heard or listened to have been begging for such a long time. So yeah, that's what I've been doing up until this point and plan to continue doing.
I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, you know, you're one of the most prominent social housing campaigners, and, you know, aside from appearances like this, you're actively out there in the country raising awareness for a lot of the squalid conditions often seen in social housing. For some of our listeners who might not be familiar, could you just sort of provide, I suppose, an overview of the commonalities and the issues that are seen within the sector?
It's hard to even describe some of the conditions I've really seen people living in and subject to. I mean, seeing really is believing. I've been in homes where I've had to cover my shoes with Sainsbury's bags before I went in because it was absolutely flooded with raw sewage. I've been in homes riddled with damp and mould. I've spoken to people dying of lung cancer, for example. Their homes riddled with damp and mould, cockroaches, mice, ceilings collapsing, leaks. I've taken people to hospital because ceilings or parts of a ceiling has collapsed on top of them. And it is so frequent. Honestly, the list could go on. It's endless, and it's a lot more common than I think. I mean, when I say this, I'm not talking about 10, 15 people. I've spoken to hundreds, if not thousands of people up and down the country. They've come to me on social media, in person. I've been to entire estates that are falling to bits, and people are subject to those conditions. Young people, vulnerable individuals. It's much bigger than any listener would be able to imagine, and it's so common. This is a crisis that's been building for generations, and these sorts of living conditions, there have been situations, one lady, for example, 27 years she'd been living in disrepair. That is longer than I've been alive. That's how long these issues have been going on for. That's how long these issues have been allowed to continue for. And local authorities, housing associations, and governments simply did not take it seriously enough. And what I can tell you is all of those sorts of bodies that are supposed to be there to look after us, especially the most vulnerable, they all knew this was going on. I've spoken to MPs that have told me that these housing issues take up the majority of their caseload and have done for a very long time. So no one can sit here and tell me they didn't know about these issues. It simply wasn't seen. There wasn't political will to deal with it, unfortunately. And now it's got to a point where people are dying. The biggest disgrace is Grenfell happened, and 7 years on, people are still living in conditions like this.
I mean, you sort of mentioned the sort of cognizant nature of things and how people have allowed this to happen, and issues of housing, and particularly social housing, and the stigmas that's often attached to it. It's been quite low on the political and policy agenda in recent decades. Why do you think that is?
An element of there being no political will to deal with the real issues, a lack of understanding. Our politicians will not be living in the conditions that I'm seeing people living in up and down the country. I think that plays a massive role. It's very easy to talk about an issue, but seeing people live in those conditions or living in those conditions yourself gives you a different type of motivation for it to want to change. And also, they've just been completely out of touch with reality, I think. They've been focusing every single election, even this election that's just passed. We all heard how they were talking about home ownership off of the back of a cost of living crisis and global pandemic, when so many young people are struggling to pay their rent every month, completely out of touch with people's realities. But also, we've seen that they've been talking about home ownership election after election and the right to buy scheme. The right to buy scheme is one of the leading causes as to why we find ourselves in this situation now with the housing crisis, especially with social housing.
Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, when it was introduced, right, under Margaret Thatcher, it was under the promise that working class people will get to buy their own home, and it sounded great on the surface of it, but there was also this promise that the homes would be rebuilt. And what we've seen is that's not the case. In fact, what's happening now and over the last decade is every year we are selling off and knocking down more social homes than we're actually building. Yet we've got 145,000 homeless kids, that number continuing to grow. And to put that into perspective, that's enough homeless kids to fill the O2 Arena more than 7 times over. We've got 1.3 million people waiting to get into social housing, yet we're not building enough. And in fact, we're selling off under the right to buy and knocking down more homes than we're building. That's not how we tackle this crisis. It has to go. And consecutive governments have sat back and allowed this to happen, even though they could have predicted that this would be the case 10, 20 years ago. There are so many issues across the board, but I think it comes back to being completely out of touch with people's realities and fundamentally not caring enough. We don't have people like me in Westminster, or people that look like me or have had the same experience. And that's why I want to encourage people to get into politics. There should be more representation. There should be more class representation, because perhaps if that was the case, if there were people within Westminster who have experienced situations like this, it would have been further up the political agenda than it has been up until now.
I mean, you sort of mention in your book that issues of poor conditions and social housing particularly affect those from ethnic minority backgrounds, those from working class backgrounds. Yeah. And obviously, you know, Grenfell, the Tower fire in 2017, that's located in Kensington, one of the most affluent places in the country. 72 people died, the majority of which came from ethnic minority backgrounds. Do you think that the racial and class element of this contributes to the political inertia in a lack of action being taken to get things done?
No, absolutely. 100%. I mean, people say it all the time. Working class individuals, especially those of estates, there's this understanding that they don't come out and vote. And ultimately, that is what politicians want, especially when it comes to an election. And that is why I believe there hasn't been enough political will. It's also the type of people that we're talking about here. We're talking about working class individuals. Often, especially in my cases, I've seen it with my own eyes. The people coming to me, the majority happen to be from black and ethnic minority groups. That's not to say that there aren't white people living in social housing affected equally as bad, but the vast majority that have come to me and that I've seen have been from black and ethnic minority groups. And I think that has a role to play in it too. And I think it's sort of self-explanatory in the sense that Grenfell happened more than 7 years ago, right? And we know the demographic of people that lived in Grenfell at the time. And I've always said since Grenfell, had a fire on that scale happened in a block, not a residential block, an office block in Canary Wharf, for example, will they have been treated in the same way? Would it have taken so long for an inquiry to happen? Would it have taken so long for justice to be delivered? I don't believe so. I believe it's because of the people that were living in Grenfell at the time, and the fact that even 7 years on, I can still go around the country and still visit people living in estates, in tower blocks, in equally as dangerous and sort of poor conditions, the same sorts of issues that members of the Grenfell community had been complaining about prior to the fire, but were ignored, says it all for me. So I do think class and race plays a massive role in this, but also we have to acknowledge the state of the private rented sector too. The fact that I believe it is 1 in 4 homes in the private rented sector doesn't even meet the decent home standard.
That hasn't been updated since 2006.
No,
right?
no, it hasn't. I don't believe it has since 2006. But so it's probably worse than that, even now. But the thing is, what sort of makes things worse in the private sector is the extortionate rents people, especially young people, are expected to pay to live in conditions which put their health and safety at risk. So it is poor across the board, across the rental sector at the moment. But I think it's an absolute disgrace what's been allowed to happen to social housing tenants, working class individuals, people from black and ethnic minority groups in this country. And the fact that there's not been enough political will to tackle this issue. Yet we bang on about home ownership and we bang on about the right to buy scheme, which has completely destroyed the rental sector in our country.
I mean, the people that can affect change, those in Westminster, over recent years, as your profile has grown, as you detail in your book, you've had meetings and you've tried to sort of be the voice for the many who won't even know how to, I suppose, engage with the political systems. How has that been for you? Obviously, you sort of speak and you sort of reflect on being an outsider coming in. There's not many people from your background and our background who are often in these spaces. How has it sort of been trying to represent the interests of those living in social housing with the people within Westminster who may not be able to relate to some of your experiences?
It's good. It's really, really good. And how I've ended up in this position, I don't know, but I know I'm blessed too. And that is why whenever I go into any of these rooms, I make it clear what the situations of those that are on the outside of Westminster, what their situations are, what their realities are, and the fact that things need to change. I mean, when I first went into Westminster, I think it was to meet Michael Gove. I was going to wear whatever I liked, basically. I wasn't going to dress in a suit. I wasn't going to conform to sort of their standards or expectations. I was going to go as I am. And the reason I was going there wasn't because I was trying to get a job. It was to go there to tell them that they have failed so many people outside of their ivory towers, let's say, and people continue to suffer even after Grenfell. And that's what I've done ever since. I dress how I like. I go in there. I'm honest. I try to reflect what it is that I'm hearing at a grassroots level, up and down the country. There's still that uncomfortable feeling going in there. I still go in there and I still look at Westminster. I still look at Prime Minister's questions and the MPs that we have had in the past. And I don't see any of them that reflect myself or anyone that I know. And fundamentally, I think things need to change there. Things need to start changing there. How can we be truly representative of our nation if we're not truly representing all classes, including those that are working class?
Have there been sort of any politicians that have stood out to you as trying to progress the cause? You and Gove seem to have quite a good relationship.
Yeah, there's been a number, and there's been a number of Labour MPs, for example, that have been talking about housing for a very long time. Siobhan McDonough, my MP, she's done a lot around temporary accommodation and the state of temporary accommodation. Karen Buck has done a lot around that too, as well as many others. But I think Michael Gove, I was perhaps glad that I met Michael Gove instead of the previous housing secretaries, because quite frankly, in my own personal opinion, they were useless. And I've spoken to loads across the sector that thought the exact same. But having conversations with him, yes, he got through the social housing regulation bill. Did I want it to be stronger? Absolutely. The Renters Reform Bill didn't get through, but the difference was, in terms of conversation, was that he was receptive to actually the realities of what was going on. There was even a time which it wasn't made public or anything, but I took him into one of the homes that I had dealt with. I was struggling with a local authority so much. I messaged him. He said absolutely he would come, and he did. And things changed. And by taking him into those situations, he got to see the realities, not just see photos and videos of it. He actually was stood in someone's reality, living in slum conditions. So I do think he got it. But I think he perhaps was in the wrong party. I mean, not in regards to social housing, but especially the Renters Reform Bill. He is one individual that I thought cared, but you need your whole party to care in order to get legislation through, and that simply just wasn't going to happen. And if the shoe was on the other foot and maybe he was in another party, things may have turned out differently. What I hope now is, obviously, we've got a Labour government, we've got a Secretary of State that has lived in social housing, knows how important it is. It's the first time that has ever happened. And I think it's inspired a lot of people, especially from working class communities. But I hope Angela is able to deliver what it is that people so desperately need in relation to housing and tackle the crisis in the right areas. Because Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer have been talking about delivering economic prosperity. They won't do that unless they tackle the housing crisis in this country.
How do you think history will judge the Conservative government over its 14-year reign and in relation to housing policy specifically?
How can I put this politely? Absolutely shambolic. I think they've been an absolute disgrace since they've got in. Perhaps if they had made different decisions, especially under the coalition government, especially around housing, we may have been able to avoid situations where people have died as a result of poor conditions, or, for example, Grenfell, where lessons really should have been learned. The Conservatives pushed the agenda of home ownership more than anything at a time where the rental sector was collapsing around everyone, yet didn't take the action that was needed to address that. They peddled this notion, like they have done since Margaret Thatcher, that the most important thing is home ownership. Home ownership is the representation of your success, of your wealth. That's what young people needed. They failed to actually listen to the experiences of young people and people that were genuinely struggling. Now we find ourselves in a situation where the housing sector is in its worst situation, arguably, since the Second World War. They had the opportunity to deal with it. They failed to deal with it. And like I mentioned earlier, bar Michael Gove, I think all of the other housing secretaries before were an absolute disgrace and failed at their jobs. To many, it looked as though it was just a stepping stone to another job, when actually they should have taken it seriously and understood that everyone in this country needs a safe and decent place to call home, and therefore they should have made sure they delivered that for everyone. They failed to do that. And as politicians, if I was a politician anyway, and I'd overseen that and the current state of the housing crisis, I'd be ashamed.
I mean, obviously now Labour are in power, and as you mentioned, Angela Raina, the housing secretary, is the first to have lived in social housing herself. What do you make of Labour's plans on housing more generally? But I suppose on social housing, they haven't actually explicitly mentioned much. What do you sort of make of their plans?
Angela understands where these issues are. I spoke to her last year, I think it was. We had a conversation, and they get how bad things are in the rental sector. And they have perhaps spoken about it more so than at any other election prior to this. They've talked about building more council homes. They've also acknowledged the state of the private sector. Again, though, they haven't given us much detail. They've not really given us numbers or anything to really hold on to, apart from saying they're going to build 1.5 million homes. So I do believe if they're going to meet that target, they have to prioritise the building of social homes, because that is where the current crisis is. That's where the majority of people are waiting for a home at the moment. That's where the 145,000 homeless kids are currently stuck waiting for a place to call home. That number will continue to grow if we don't prioritise this. So they are going to have to build more council homes on a scale as big, or at least similarly to as big as after the Second World War, if they're really going to tackle this crisis, but dealing with the affordability, the quality, and the state of the private rented sector too, because things are becoming so unaffordable for people in the private rented sector. We need to get rid of Section 21. But there has to be control of rents. It cannot continue, because it's going to drive homelessness and has driven homelessness. My worry is, though, was at least in Rachel Reeves's speech, where she mentioned that in terms of housing, it's going to be built by the private sector, and there's going to be a reliance on the private sector. Often from what I've seen, especially within housing, when it comes to the private sector and contractors, is there's one thing they care about above all, and that is making as much money as possible. It's been done before. It hasn't worked in terms of council homes. We need government to be building and local authorities to be building council homes. It is an investment. It's been shown already that if they invest, the economy will reap the rewards in years to come. So it is, yes, it's going to cost in the short term, but it will benefit massively in the long term, in the prosperity of this country. But there has to be an understanding that it's going to take money from the government. But again, it comes down to priorities and political will. And it's whether or not Rachel Reeves sees it as important as some of the other issues that the country is facing. But they will not deliver the economic prosperity they are promising unless they first and foremost recognise that.
Do you think there's a risk that Raina, who wants, it seems to me, to be radical in housing and especially lead on social housing building, is there a risk that she suffers a similar fate to Michael Gove in a way, being so ambitious, but there's an internal power struggle with Rachel Reeves in the Treasury?
It could be difficult, I think. I don't think Angela Raina could end up in the same situation as Michael Gove. I think things were a lot harder for him to do under the Conservative government. I think there are a lot more Labour MPs in support of building council homes, that understanding that we need it, understanding of the fundamental crisis and its roots when it comes to the housing crisis. So I think there will be a lot of people internally within the Labour Party that will support Angela Raina in building social homes, tackling the state of the private rented sector. So I don't see her fate ending up as Michael Gove's did. That's not to say it won't be difficult. It will be difficult, especially in conversations with the Chancellor and getting the funding and the money in order to deliver that. But if she does that, she has the opportunity to have the biggest impact on the housing sector as a Secretary of State than anyone has ever had since the Second World War. So if that's not a motivator, then I don't know what is. And what will make it the icing on the cake is the fact that she is from a social housing background too. So it's going to be difficult, but do I think it can work with enough support from the Labour Party? Absolutely.
I mean, you sort of said in your book that after COVID and the instability of the last 14 years, we're sort of approaching another Beveridge report moment. Obviously, the report that sort of laid the foundations for the NHS, and, you know, reform of the welfare state would encompass many things. What would you personally like to see from a housing and a social housing perspective introduced to sort of better support people?
Well, our foundations are broken, just like it was after the Second World War. And that includes housing. That is why they invested so much in building social housing, because they wanted to repair our foundations at the time. And that is exactly what needs to happen now. There has to be a bottom-up approach to this. I said to Angela Raina when I first met her, I said, our foundations are broken. That is what voters, that's what people up and down the country care about. All they are asking from this government is to help repair our foundations. Don't promise us things that is not going to benefit our lives. Don't dangle any golden carrots in front of us. Just fix the fundamentals that we all need. That is our NHS, that is housing, that is education, that is our environment. And if they can do that, that will be enough. And what I'd like to see in regards to housing is our foundations is social housing. When everything else collapses, and we even saw it with mortgages, right? Everyone believes, oh, if you own your own house, you're secure, you're stable. We saw with the mortgage crisis that actually that isn't necessarily true. Now, if they can provide stability, security, and a decent standard of living amongst council housing, the private rented sector, I think people will be happy from a housing perspective, but they need to build quality social homes. In terms of the 1.5 million homes they say they're going to build, I want to see, or I hope to see anyway, the majority being council homes, and council homes that's going to last, not these new builds that we're seeing now that are falling to bits after 5 years. Quality social homes. This isn't about money and money for developers. This is about people's lives fundamentally. And we shouldn't be playing chess and games of chess with people's lives, prioritizing profit over their safety. And that is what we want to see from the government. We just want to see common sense, a common sense approach to tackling this. And that is with a bottom-up approach.
I mean, you've been a social housing activist and campaigner for many years. And you sort of spoke of your frustrations with the political processes that dictate action or lack thereof on housing. Have you ever considered going into politics and sorting it out root and branch yourself?
Maybe. Maybe. I mean, as I'm getting older, I'm probably considering it a lot more than I would have a few years ago. I just wanted this crisis of housing to be fixed. But I have been banging on about class and representation and wanting to see more people like me in politics. And sometimes, I've learned from housing anyway, sometimes you have to be that person that puts your head above the parapet and actually goes in there to try and shake things up. And I've been able, well, I hope anyway, to shake things up from the outside, especially in regards to housing. So maybe one day, but I mean, I've been doing this since I think I was 21, 22, I'm now 25. I'm a bit tired. So I have to see, but I'll always be a housing campaigner, that's for sure, regardless of whatever it is that I do. If I go into Westminster, if I go into politics, and maybe I will. But what I've said is I want to see this government succeed, especially in regards to housing. If I can help that, fair enough. Whether that be inside or out, I don't know. But what I will continue to do is advocate for those outside of Westminster that are struggling, the people with real life experiences that need support and need the government to create change, and will continue to try and shake things up as much as possible.
Well, that's a good note to end on. Kwajo, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.